As you can tell by the title, I have another Razer Blade 14 2014 edition benchmark video for you guys. This week I'm taking a look at Call of Duty Black Ops 3 multiplayer and how it performs on the laptop in terms of average min-max frames per second, as well as some of the internal temperature readings that I was recording while playing the game. This is another game that a lot of people were requesting in some of my past videos, leaving comments. So if you are leaving comments with game suggestions, I hear you, and I'm going to do my best to bring those videos for you as soon as possible. And in terms of schedule, I think after this video I want to be looking at Rust, since they just put out a pretty large update and some people were asking about how that game runs on the laptop, as well as looking at Overwatch after that. I'm also interested in doing some benchmarks for games like No Man's Sky, since the developers have put out a few patches, as well as NVIDIA has released their driver for their chips, mobile and desktop chips. So if there's any other suggestions, like I said, please leave it in the comments below. Anyways, let's get started with the video. Like I said, I'm benchmarking Black Ops 3, and I ran 6 tests on this benchmark. And instead, I normally do multiple resolutions. I chose to run the game at the same 1920 by 1080p resolution, but I did multiple tests on the scale of that resolution. I ended up choosing to do this for Black Ops 3 because by default, I noticed on the PC version of the game, Black Ops 3 scales your native resolution to 50%. So whatever is the native resolution of your laptop or your monitor, the game scales it to 50% while playing multiplayer. So I thought that was pretty strange. Normally games are running at a native 100%. So I wanted to test out the differences between running it at default and scaling it up at 100%. I ran each scale with the default low, medium, high graphical settings, as well as, like I said, looking at min, max, average FPS and the temperatures of the NVIDIA 870M GPU chip and each core inside of the CPU. The first test I'm looking at is 1080p resolution scaled at 50% with low graphical settings. The game performed really well, as you would imagine, looking at an average around 120 frames per second, with a min sitting about 99 frames and a max reaching about 140 frames. Each CPU core was sitting at around the upper 70s to high 80s in degrees Celsius, with the GPU reaching about 90 degrees Celsius, but mostly sitting in the mid 80s throughout my test. This is a pretty comfortable temperature for this model of the GPU, and the game performed really smoothly, as you can see from the frames we were getting. The second test I went ahead with is 1080p resolution scaled at 50% using medium graphical settings. We saw here a slight dip in frames per second, but still reaching to a respectable 133 frames per second at max, 93 frames at the lowest, hitting at about an average of 115 frames per second, so really high FPS still. Temperatures looked about the same. The CPU ran a little bit hotter at this point, reaching to about 96 degrees at a really short time period, but the GPU stayed roughly the same, leveling out about 90 to 93 degrees Celsius. And our last 50% scale resolution test, as you would imagine, is running the game at high graphical settings. We're still seeing a really high frames per second. Here I was getting to around 100 frames on average, with a high reaching about 130, low dipping to the 90s. The game still obviously is running extremely smooth at high graphical settings, but at 50% resolution scale, it's really hard to appreciate even the graphics that an average COD game is going to give you on PC. The temperature-wise for the setting, the CPU sustained 96 degrees high a little bit longer than the last test at medium settings, but the GPU clocked to about 90 degrees at max, with hovering around the mid-80s. So, like I said, at 50% resolution scale, the game obviously runs extremely well, but you're going to add some blur to the gameplay because you're scaling at 50%, so it's really not as crisp due to that downscaling. For now, moving forward, I've scaled the game up to the native 100% scale 1080p at low graphical settings, and you're seeing a pretty large drop in FPS compared to the 3 previous tests. On average, I was getting about 55 frames per second at this setting, with the game reaching upwards of 68 frames and dipping as low as 50. This does show about half of the previous low graphics test that I ran at half the resolution scale, so it measures about right, but it's a huge drop. Temperature-wise, the game ran about the same temperatures as we were seeing before, the CPU capping at about 90 degrees, and the GPU stuck in the mid-80s and only reaching as high as 90 degrees, so it's still looking at about the same. Looking at medium graphical settings with 100% scale, we see another dip in average FPS. I was getting around 44 frames per second here while playing a match, and with the minimum being around 40 frames per second and maxing about 50. It's not a huge variation playing at this settings from min to max, but the temperatures here were actually fairly cool compared to the other settings we've tested in the past. Looking at the CPU, averaging about mid-80s at the time of playing, and the GPU still hovering at about mid to high 80 degrees Celsius. I think this is actually the first real bottleneck that we're seeing due to the drop in CPU temperature for the hardware. The last test that I ran was high graphical settings at 100% scale, 1080p resolution. The game is still technically playable at around 40 frames per second on average, but I'm not sure why you would with all these other options and being on PC. It's playable if you're in terms of Xbox or PlayStation standards, but I reached as high as about 46 frames per second during the match and also dropped as low as 35. The same temperature difference in this settings as we saw in the last test, where the CPU was spiking to about mid to high 80s and the GPU holding fairly steady around 90 degrees, so it definitely shows, in my opinion, that there is a bottleneck once you're reaching these last two tests. With the frames dropping pretty heavily at 100% scale resolution compared to 50%, and the graphical quality of even the highest setting of 50% scale not really being up to par for wanting to look at a pretty game, I would personally recommend running Black Ops 3 at high graphical settings with the resolution set to 1920 by 1080p scaled to 70%. Running the game at these settings, I was seeing an average of around 70 frames per second with a max of around 80 and only dipping to around 57 FPS, which is just under that, 60 FPS gold standard that everyone seems to have. With these settings, the game runs really smooth throughout the entire match, and it's still a fairly pretty game to look at, so you don't have to sacrifice on either the frames per second or the beauty of the game at this setting. So, well, anyways, guys, I hope you found this video helpful. More will be coming on the way. Please let me know in the comments of any other game suggestions that you guys are curious about running this older generation laptop. And please like and subscribe for more from me. Thanks for taking the time to check out my video, and as always, I hope your day is beer and Skittles.